If you knew. This sentence is engraved in the very depth of my soul. I shall never forget it. Above all, I shall never forget the way in which I felt it. This phrase carried all the suffering and the calm confidence of someone who knows everything. In just a few words, it conveys the ordeal that would transform our everyday lives, a few months later, forever.
In 2005 in Paris, Anne-Dauphine and Loïc were living an almost idyllic existence. Following their son Gaspard, who was almost 4, and their daughter Thaïs, aged 2, they were expecting a third child in mid-July. They had fulfilling careers and loved each other very much. In short, life was good to them. Barring one small problem that had emerged that summer at the seaside, disrupting the perfect joy they sought. Looking at the footprints left in the sand by Thaïs' tiny feet, they noticed something strange about the way she walked. Her big toe tended to bend outwards.
When we got back to Paris, we consulted a doctor who said that it was nothing, so we consulted another one. Consequently, just a few months later, on the day of Thaïs' second birthday, Loïc and I went to see a neurologist at one of Paris's biggest hospitals. He told us that this was not a small problem that would ruffle our happiness. Rather, it was a tidal wave that was going to turn our lives upside down. A little girl who had been perfect until then was suffering from an incurable degenerative genetic disease. It was just before her second birthday, and she did not have long to live, just a few months or a few short years.
Metachromatic leukodystrophy. This is the name of this incurable genetic disease. Anne-Dauphine and Loïc were both healthy carriers of a genetic anomaly. They had transmitted the defective gene to Thaïs. This disease progressively destroys the entire nervous system. There was no hope of a cure for Thaïs. And the baby that they were expecting had a 1 in 4 chance of being affected as well. Thaïs would soon not be able to walk, nor speak, nor see, nor hear, nor move. What would she have left? In her book, Two Small Footprints in the Wet Sand, Anne-Dauphine tells her story.
We told Gaspard and Thaïs the news. That night was not easy. We did not want to wake up, ever. To sleep forever in order to avoid facing the truth. What a temptation. At the center of this turmoil, we experienced a moment of grace. A window opened, letting in a glimmer of light. Thaïs celebrated her second birthday and laughed as she opened her presents. That was on the 1st of March 2006. At that moment, we realized that children have a beautiful way of living spontaneously in the present moment. And once the tears had dried, it was Thaïs' birthday, and there was clearly no reason why we shouldn't celebrate her birthday. I think that we had never celebrated birthday like that. We overdid it somewhat. We sang too loudly, we had our tears to hide, and above all, we dared to be happy. It was the first time that we dared to be happy in the middle of a catastrophe, and I think it left a mark on us. We actually have the right to be happy, even when we are in distress.
And as a result of the example set by our children, we instinctively adopted this state of mind, living 1 minute, 1 day at a time, living in the present. Because from that moment on, I almost stopped looking to the future, telling myself, I must concentrate on the immediate, or else I shall not be able to get through it.
Every morning, the struggle would restart. To avoid despair, we held on to simple everyday things, as if they were a life belt. Thaïs was still the same charming, boisterous, mischievous little girl she had been before. She was very strong-willed. Within a few days, we began to notice obvious signs of her illness. Her hands shook. She found it hard to put the top on a felt-tip pen or raise her spoon. A few weeks after the news, we made a decisive step, almost without noticing it. We had an appointment with a professor who specialized in leukodystrophies. We wanted to find out more about the disease. What were the stages in the deterioration? What would death be like? When one knows, one has less to fear. Thaïs came with us.
But there was no way that all the questions could be answered. A lot is still unknown to medicine in this area. The disease is too rare. It affects only 1 child out of several tens of thousands.
I think that was the point where we both realized that nothing could be done to cure a little girl who was there before us, but that there was something to be done in her life, and we did not feel powerless to add some life to her days. This is the phrase used by a professor called Professor Bernard, who pioneered palliative care in France, who said when you are no longer able to add days to someone's life, you can always add some life to that person's days. Thaïs heard about what was going to happen to her. We told her that this is not what happened in the lives of other little girls, but this was her life, and we promised that we would do everything to help her live a beautiful life, and that above all, she would never be lacking in love.
Both Anne-Dauphine and Loïc worked in Paris. Living with Thaïs's illness quickly became very complicated. A real obstacle course that included Gaspard's school run, Thaïs's childminder, and the physiotherapy sessions. That's when a network of volunteers, including relatives and friends, came to the family's assistance so that they could reorganize their lives.
However, the disease was progressing fast. Thaïs could now no longer walk at all. But the worst was hidden from view, namely the pain she was experiencing. The illness caused Thaïs to experience neuropathic pains, generally considered to be unbearable. The only remedy to ease the pain was an extensive list of drugs. We hadn't realized that Thaïs was going to suffer. Then she began to feel pain. One day I was next to Thaïs and she was in pain. She cried out loudly. So I gave her medicine. And as I waited for the medicine to take effect, I stayed beside her, powerless, just watching her suffering myself to see her like this. And as is often the case, there is a point at which it becomes unbearable. Your ears hurt, your heart breaks. That's when you want only one thing, that it should stop. You honestly want her life to end right then, because it is unbearable. So I told her, Thaïs, if you can't bear it anymore, you can ask for it to stop, to ask for your life to end. And when I said that, my little Thaïs fell silent. She stopped screaming. So I wondered what I had said. She was all red and flushed. She was holding in her scream. And I realized that she was saying, it's okay, I can handle it. Yes, it hurts, but later I'll feel better. Mommy, if it hurts you too much, I'll not show it. I'll protect you. That's when I realized that a child should not have to protect its parents. And I reminded myself that we are not powerless in the face of suffering. We are always able to love. Faced with Thaïs's unbearable suffering, I think that or rather we, because you were there as well, we experienced an inhuman level of love. And thanks to Thaïs, I've realized that there is a remedy to suffering, and that is love. Thaïs never said, I love you, as much as the time before she lost the power of speech one morning. She never spoke again. Her silence was intimidating, and it hurt us. How would we communicate? I wanted to cry out for her. But Thaïs looked at us in silence, and through her silence, she seemed to be saying, trust me.
As we saw her illness progress, we were surprised by how naturally she seemed to be living through it. It seemed obvious to her, whereas we were apprehensive at every stage. And you just had to look at her to see how she was coping, to be able to say to yourself, there you are. It's normal. It's natural for her. She helped us immensely in accepting the reality of what was happening and in going forward with her. It was truly remarkable to see that.
One day, she lost her sight, and this was one of my biggest fears, because I imagined myself being blind, and I realized that if I lost my sight, it would be a nightmare. How can one cope without being able to see? And we were so surprised to see Thaïs experience this in a very natural way. That's when we understood that Thaïs was not just coping with her illness in a passive way, saying to herself, there's nothing I can do. She helped us to think in a new way. Thaïs had accepted her life. She was confident in herself and she trusted us. She was calling us to trust her in this loss of communication.
I think that when she lost all the conventional means of communicating, we had to go further in the way we related to each other. Sometimes, when we have the ability to see, hear or speak, we do not go far enough. Under these circumstances, we had to go further if we wanted to stay in contact with her and share those things that are deep in our hearts and souls without using our usual senses.
She accomplished something absolutely remarkable. We forgot everything that we had known previously in order to communicate. We had to forget everything to adapt to her. I remember one day, she was lying in her bed and she sighed in a particular way. So I said, yes, I love you too. For me, there was no doubt. That sigh said, I love you. It was a genuine conversation of love. But it requires humility to approach a little girl like Thaïs and to say to her, there are things that I know, but with you I have to forget everything. With you, I don't know anything anymore, so teach me. I think that we reversed roles. We didn't teach her how to speak or to see. She was the one who taught us everything.
The 29th of June 2006, a moment of absolute joy. Gaspard and Thaïs were joined by little sister, Idyllic.
It's the miracle of life. I forget everything. The horror of the disease which threatens Idyllic, the fear of the future. However, once again, I could not sleep that night. I felt the joy of the birth, sure enough, but it was tainted with a dark cloud, that of fear.
One week after the birth, the results arrived. Idyllic was suffering from the same disease.
Quand on est revenu ici à la maison,
when we returned home, appalled by this news, we sat down together on the sofa. We felt simply crushed and had a whiskey, then a second. And I very much remember feeling at that moment that it wasn't just the two of us on the sofa, but three. And it was a great comfort, an incredible comfort, to be able to say, God is here with us, next to us. He's crying with us and feeling what we feel. He's not up there somewhere far away and absent. I really felt him almost physically there next to us, crying and suffering with us.
Once we knew that Idyllic was ill, my own greatest suffering was seeing no reaction at all from Loïc. He was like an automaton. He didn't say a word while I was crying and really showing how much I was suffering. What frightened me the most that day was thinking, we're going to split up. We're not together anymore. He didn't react. It's too much for him. And then suddenly, when I saw a tear in his eye, I thought, we're saved. It seems crazy that my biggest worry that day was our marriage. If we remain united as a couple, we might manage to climb this mountain, whereas if we were apart, that would add yet another difficulty.
We also realized that each of us was living through our anguish in a different way. Anne-Dauphine like a woman, and I like a man, with different ways of expressing ourselves, or not doing so. And we realized that it was important to be able to meet together in our suffering, to comfort one another, to be able to say, I do understand, I'm crying and suffering with you, and tell me how you feel.
And I think that day, crying together, we decided to do all we could to remain together always. It's true that it was far from being a fairy tale, but we decided to love one another. Yes, love is a decision. Even if we had been deeply in love, we would then have had to decide to love each other afterwards, to decide to do everything to stay together. We committed ourselves to one another.
We were careful to make sure we had time together as a couple too. Even if sometimes it didn't seem like quite the right moment. And in consequence, not to be attached like clams to a sick child.
The most difficult thing for a mother is to let go, to allow one's child to live its life. At Pentecost, they told us that Thaïs was dying, that she was really in her last few hours. And I had always said that I would be there, that I would be with her. I hung on to her desperately. But it turned out that she didn't die that day. And we also had a baby phone that I kept plugged in, thinking, I'm going to keep this by my ear all the time, so I can run to her if I hear that she's in her last moments. It was then that the doctor who was looking after Thaïs at home told me, you have to let her live. I found these words terrible. I hated the doctor for saying that to me. I said to her, "How dare you?" And she said, "Don't, under any circumstances, impose yourself." She actually said this to me with a great deal of tact. I understood. She told me of some children who had died at the very moment when their mother went to buy a sandwich, just as their mother left the room. She said to me, "Thaïs can't live. She can't go away into a corner. She can't hide. Let her live. Let her choose." There is nothing more difficult than letting a child go. But by unplugging the baby alarm that evening and until the end of Thaïs' life, I think that I allowed her to live. And I told her, "It's your life. Go ahead, my love."
Marseille in the south of France. 4 months of good and difficult moments. This is where Anne-Dauphine and Loïc had to take the family away from home 5 weeks after the birth of Asilis. Thanks to a bone marrow transplant in the hospital in Marseille, the life of Asilis was saved. However, the transplant didn't halt the illness. Today, Asilis is a very disabled little girl with an uncertain life expectancy.
We promised Asilis that we would love her for her whole life, just as she was, whatever the results of the bone marrow transplant. We tell her every day that we love her and she fills us with happiness, just being as she is. Only 1 week after our return to Paris, Thaïs began to suffer terribly again. We were drowning in the frightening suffering that was progressing quickly. It was so violent that the doctors had to constantly review their medication so that Thaïs didn't suffer too much. Sickness attacks her last defenses. Both girls were being treated at home. Asilis was confined to her room after her transplant in the hope of soon discovering the world that had so far been hidden from her eyes. Thaïs, on the other hand, was declining inexorably. The nurses were looking after her not in order to make her better, but to make her life more tolerable. I love the capacity that Thaïs had to hold on to all the happy times. Despite all her faculties being so impaired, I can affirm that my daughter's heart still knew how to swell with love and joy. I didn't just see what this girl was lacking, but what she had lost, she gained in another way, in an intensity of life that went beyond us. I think that Thaïs taught us how to love, that she taught us love with a capital L. I remember one story that I particularly love, which sums up Thaïs for me. It was at the very end of her life. She could only just manage to move her head a little, a few centimeters. And instinctively, when someone entered the room, she would turn her head towards them. So I went into her room one day. She turned her head, and I positioned myself next to her. I began to speak to her, and then she turned her head to the other side. So I went round to the other side of the bed and continued saying, "Thaïs, I'm here." But she turned her head back round to the other side again, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, until I began to get worried. I began to be sad, thinking, here's yet another thing to mourn. She can no longer tell where we are.
This is when Anne-Dauphine heard a little purr that she recognized among everything else. Thaïs was laughing.
She laughed by purring. When I heard this very significant sound, I thought, what's going on? Why is she laughing? And then I understood that she was playing hide and seek. Since she was very small, hide and seek was her favorite game. And this was a way she'd found to play hide and seek, to make the other person disappear from her field of vision. We rediscovered our childhood selves a little thanks to Thaïs, and this was thanks to a tiny girl. I think that with Thaïs, the less she had, the more she became. The more she lost her capacities, the more her soul of a child developed. The more the little girl that she was revealed, the more we wanted to love her.
It's true that at the end of her life, she had a kind of gravity, an incredible intensity, which is really paradoxical because, in a sense, she was just a body that could hardly move, lying on a bed, and yet she had an astonishing presence. Moreover, there were many people, friends, both close and not so close to the family, who came to pass some time in the apartment. And many who went into Thaïs's bedroom with a bit of apprehension came out again with a peace that was a little supernatural. And they would say, it's incredible, it's good being by Thaïs. We could stay for 5 minutes, half an hour, and feel at peace.
It makes so little sense, the strength of this little girl who was in such a fragile state, that all at once we knew where this love came from. This was the greatest evidence of my life. It was pure love, love that was absolutely divine, and Thaïs was a beautiful instrument for it. I think that Thaïs was a beautiful instrument of this divine love.
It's true that at the end of her life we really had the feeling that she was simply diffusing God, that she was a conduit by which we had the impression of having a little door into heaven in this room, through Thaïs. It's a rather paradoxical thing to say, but we saw the life of Thaïs as a wonderful gift, and that God had entrusted this little girl to us, and that the life she had was an immense gift that He gave to us.
It was in the silence of Christmas night that Loïc and Anne-Dauphine heard the last breath of Thaïs. She was 3 3/4. 1 year after her death, Loïc and Anne-Dauphine had a 4th child, the folly of love. He's called Arthur, and he's in good health. This month, let us pray for all the families who are living through the difficulties of having a disabled child, and also for ourselves, that we may welcome the smallest and receive from them. The word of God for this month is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 2 to 4. And calling to him a child, Jesus put him in the midst of them and said, "Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven."